Good morning, everyone. I'm Gene Cubbison, and today we are dedicating this time, usually reserved for Politically Speaking, to a special program as part of NBC7's recognition of Black History Month. Here in San Diego and elsewhere, sadly, that history covers times past when African Americans all too often were targets of racial discrimination and worse. Well, times changed, thankfully, more slowly than was tolerable to most, but today we are here to celebrate that change and honor two leading lights of our African American community and, yes, San Diego's community at large. And they are here with us now. And they are Leon Williams, the first African American elected to San Diego City Council and later the County Board of Supervisors, and the Reverend George Walker Smith, the first African American elected to the Board of Education of San Diego's Unified School District, elected 4 times, serving as president 4 times, and for a spell, president of the National Association of School Boards. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us here today. And just to start things off, we will start with you, Reverend Smith, in alphabetical order. During your ministry, which began back east and brought you here to San Diego, you crossed paths with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You recall those and share that with us.
I lived a few blocks from where he lived in Montgomery. I was from down there before I came out here. Quite a man. Used to go on Sunday. I was a Presbyterian. I would go on Sunday down to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to hear him preach, because he's quite a speaker, as you know.
Oh, yes, so spellbinder, yeah. Did he impart some wisdom to you that you can recall for us?
Yes, anytime he got up to speak, he had something to say. I'm not the kind of person who believe or enjoy listening to someone who has very little to say.
And powerful, his speeches must have just mesmerized you, as they did everybody. And Leon, you were, as I recall, making your mark in the Urban League and Neighborhood Youth Corps when Reverend Smith arrived here in 1956. What was this city like? We know that there was Jim Crow in those days, and not the name of a person, but a kind of a manner of segregation that was sort of government-sponsored. What was it like in San Diego?
Well, San Diego, surprisingly, although part of California, which was one of the most liberal states in the country at the time, was still quite segregated. And African-American people, and not only African Americans, but other non-white people were subject to quite a lot of inequality and discrimination in those days. And as a student, I graduated from San Diego State in 1950, and housing was very discriminated in those days. Restaurants, non-white people could not go in regular restaurants, and so we had some student organizations at San Diego State that militated against the problems that we had in the 40s.
Going back to the 40s, and as I recall, there was police presence, which was not very inviting. I imagine that they spread some fear as well as a sense of order through the communities. Am I wrong about that?
You know, you're right about that. Yes, you're very, very right. We had to be very careful of the San Diego police, and they often they harassed people on the basis of ethnicity.
What neighborhoods did you live in? Because I'm recalling that the African American community is and was, to a great extent, south of Interstate 8 and kind of out toward the east. What was that like, being out that way and venturing into town for business and the things that you had to do to build up the community here?
Well, residentially, black people weren't welcome south of Market.
Okay, even south of Market.
I think Leon probably was one of the first blacks to purchase a home north of Market.
How did that work out?
Well, it worked out all right in the end, but it took quite a little problem to get the financing. But I had been in World War II, and I think the fact that I was a veteran and had that helped me to overcome the problems.
And Reverend Smith, you referred to yourself as a preacher in a beach town. Being a preacher, that elevated your stature in the community. Did it kind of open doors and at least make things, at least from the ministry's point of view, somewhat more tolerable?
Well, I came here out of graduate school. Brought here by my Presbyterian church. I had never been to San Diego. But I came here in 1956 to start a black Presbyterian church.
Did they try to run you out of the church and so forth?
Before I got here, they tried to keep me
okay.
out of San Diego. I never will forget the dear old lady, Mrs. Violet Beck. She wrote my headquarters in Pittsburgh and everything. We hear that Reverend Smith is intelligent, a good preacher, but we don't want him here.
We don't want his kind here.
That's right.
Well, you did arrive here, and you did put roots down and succeed.
I got a house which was south of Market. She lived south of Market, and I got a house on the same block she lived in. And
she must have gotten used to it, or not?
She did get used to it because the bus stop was right out by the church where I pastored. So I would drive on Market Street and go upstairs to my office, and I never forget one day she was sitting at the bus stop.
Hold that thought right there, because with your charm, you must have made peace with all that. And we have much more ground to cover in our look at Black History Month here in San Diego, moving from the past to the present and imagining a future. Stay with us, and you'll hear more from these distinguished gentlemen. As we celebrate Black History Month, we celebrate pioneers of change in America's finest city. Reverend George Walker Smith arrived in San Diego in 1956 to lead the congregation at the Golden Hill United Presbyterian Church. It was the only integrated church in San Diego at the time. In 1963, Smith became the first African American elected to the San Diego Board of Education. He began his tenure by changing the ethnic composition of the teaching staff. Welcome back, and let's hear more from our distinguished Black History Month guests, the Reverend George Walker Smith and former City Councilman and County Supervisor Leon Williams. And where we left off, Reverend Smith, we were talking about Viola Beck, as I recall.
Yes, she was
your neighbor down south of Market Street and south of...
She was the racist who fought my even coming to San Diego.
Gotcha. Now, Market Street was the dividing line, really, where whites stayed north of that and blacks were kind of segregated down south of that. But you won her over in some fashion. You won her over.
Yeah.
Okay. Eventually, you won over a lot of people in the city, including the notable Neil Morgan, just an icon with the San Diego Evening Tribune. And in your memoir here, written about a dozen years ago, he suggested to you, and I think you didn't disagree with him, a subtitle of Conscience of the Community.
Yes. Mrs. Copley used to have a monthly luncheon down at the Chinese place on Market Street, quite a fashionable place. And she bring in about 10-gallon container of martinis, and she would invite me to come. Neil Morgan was the moderator there. So he picked that up from my attending that, not holding my peace when I was asked my opinion. I was going to give it the best I could. And one day he pulled me, George, aside, and he said, "You know what? You are the conscience of this community." And that stuck with us. And then when I decided, it was basically not the black Leon Williams and so forth who talked me into writing that little memoir, but my white friends.
Well, let's talk about that. How did the white community and the Pillars here in San Diego eventually ease your way into their midst and into the halls of powership, which brought you all the way through even to the Metropolitan Transit Board as late as 1995? How did that happen? Was it just your charm as well, or you were a man on a mission?
Well, I had a mission, of course, and I always had a notion of inclusiveness, that everybody should be treated fairly and should be having an equal opportunity. So that was my mission as a youngster, and all the time I was a social worker in the sheriff's department. I made friends with people, and they received me as a human being. And I did not act like I was not a human being. I always acted like I was as good as anybody else and expected to be treated like anybody else. And for the most part, that happened to me as I grew up and got older and older and older, as you can tell.
When you ran for city council, that was a historically white district, and ever since it has been held, the seat has been held by African Americans. How did you get in that first campaign? You had to raise money, I imagine, and you had an opponent, did you? You must have.
Well, there were opponents, right? But for some reason, there was the country was I believe opening up a little bit because there had been the uprisings and the lack of satisfaction, and there were people in San Diego who were aware of that. Frank Kern, the mayor then, was one. We were friends. I had been friends with Frank Kern before he was a politician. I had helped him get elected, so he and Floyd Morrow and some other members of the city council knew me, and we had what we call city community dialogues. We had been sitting in the city hall with council members and the mayor and the city attorney and talking about the issues that were in San Diego at that time, that in this city council at that time did not want to have the kind of problems that LA had in some other cities. So they were reaching out to us and we were responding. And I think the response was effective because we didn't have the kind of problems, the riots, and we did make some contact with the city, and there was response.
And did you feel this was coming from the heart as well as the head? Because this was a political thing to do. They wanted a constituency, but it did come from the heart?
Well, I think it came from both, heart and head. It was head that led it, but I think heart, they began to feel it because we were constructive in our approach. We were not angry, and we were not upset and in the meetings. We talked reasonable.
Gentlemen, let me pull over to the curb here for a second, park the car, and we're going to come back because we still have more time for these gentlemen's perspectives as part of our Black History Month program. Stay with us. Black History Month honors the contributions of African Americans to U.S. history. Leon Williams is recognized in San Diego for his civic service. After graduating San Diego State College in 1950, Williams became a social worker, then served the Urban League, and later became director of the Neighborhood Youth Corps program. He also was active on the Citizens Interracial Committee. In 1969, Williams became the first African American elected to the San Diego City Council to represent District 4. He was elected to the County Board of Supervisors in 1982. And we are back once again with our special guests in recognition of Black History Month, the Reverend George Walker Smith and former City Councilman and County Supervisor Leon Williams. And gentlemen, you worked your way into the white power structure. Your thoughts about how it still exists to this way? Is it more welcoming? Are you seeing more people that you have mentored come through for the Catfish Club and the African Americans that followed you on the council? How is that happening now? What do you think about today's cadre of black leadership?
There was no social interaction in San Diego.
True story?
That's true. There were not. That's right. There was total segregation.
But you had to PR yourself. You had to actually present yourself to them and move in whether they liked it or not.
Well,
yes, that's what.
Well, in my case, I was fortunate. I've always had the Coppola Press support me, basically because of Neil Morgan,
There was power behind that. Oh yeah, they recognized that.
And Herb Klein, both Presbyterian.
And I started as a social worker. I was a social
Yeah.
worker and had contact with many people over. And people recognized that. I was the first and only black social worker in San Diego County in those days. And I reached many, many people.
Yeah.
And many people thought that I was, a very good social worker. And people have said to me, well, you could be the director of the Department of Social Services in San Diego County.
Well, maybe also in the United States here. Now, you touched on this briefly. San Diego did not have the problems that LA did, the Watts riots and so forth, but there was a Black Panthers movement here. Angela Davis taught at UCSD, and there was pushback by the police and sheriff's department, but you kind of tamped things down so things didn't explode and bloodshed.
Well, I became an administrator in the sheriff's department.
Right.
And in that role, I was able to help a lot to tamp down a lot of those because they respected me in the sheriff, and the police department respected me too in those days, and I was able to talk to them, and a lot of that got tamped down.
Okay, and you calmed, from your pulpit in the ministry, you calmed things down too.
Right.
Well, I really got involved during the Watts riot.
Okay. Was there an offshoot down here, at least a militating during that same summer in August of 65?
I would like to say something about the power structure of the city.
Yes, sir. Please tell us.
And there was a power structure in the city, and it wasn't all bad. And they did more to help change the attitude of San Diego than anybody else. And I could go on naming them, but they were good. And I was fortunate enough to have had the Presbyterian Church give me 20 years of education. And there was a strong Presbyterian Church in San Diego. That's how I got here.
And you guys gave back, paid it forward to your community. You must have. I'm seeing names here down through history: William Jones, Reverend George Stevens, Wes Pratt, Charles Young, Charles Lewis, Tony Young. You brought them, mentored them, encouraged them. That's had a remarkable impact on this community, has it not?
Well, I think so. I think so because as members of the city council, they were able to modify large part of the attitudes, the harsh attitudes toward African Americans and other minorities.
And get things done politically and socially as well.
For example, I had my own public relation outlet through the Copper Press.
Okay.
They wrote stories about me way before I decided to come to San Diego. And even after I got here.
Being pushed out of Pittsburgh, as it were, in Alabama.
And that has been good because most blacks were either Baptist or Methodist. Presbyterian Church was predominantly white. And they had provided 20 years of free education. So I have tried all my life to take advantage of opportunities, using them for good.
And you've turned corners as well? Give me that in a nutshell here.
Well, I think large part of the help that I gave, people respected me, and I've had establishment people say to me that you kind of proved that the stereotypes about black people were not true that we had.
Well, they were unfair to begin with.
They were unfair to begin with, and they found out that black people could be human beings like anybody else and be just as fair and as creative and as anybody else.
Jim, let's sit back for just a second. We do have much more ground to cover here in our look at Black History Month, and we're going to come back with them for one final thought from each about San Diego going forward from their point of view. Stay with us. And we are in the home stretch of our special recognition of Black History Month, looking for some final words of wisdom going forward from the Reverend George Walker Smith and former City Councilman and County Supervisor Leon Williams. From 0 to 60 seconds, what should we take home with us from your point of view here after all we've spoken about?
Well, I think we should appreciate the fact that there have been those black and whites in San Diego who have worked to make things better. For example, let's think about the police department that's constantly in light of public. When I came here and I tried to learn about a place, the police was a discriminatory place.
Things have really changed, though. You must, if I asked you now, you would say,
yeah.
yes, sir, the world of
And
difference.
you mentioned our good friend Bill Collender, who died a couple weeks ago. Bill has not always been that way. I remember when the city council appointed me the first police review chair.
And you had a big hand in that.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Williams, we're going to end with you. Your thoughts going forward, your degree of optimism for San Diego and the community at large.
Well, I think San Diego is really a great city, has great potential, has a lot of human problems to solve. Human problems need to be solved, though, not just in San Diego, but everywhere. We have a problem as human beings of being fair to each other and recognizing each other as people with the same kind of ambitions as we all have. Everybody wants to be treated fairly. And I think that's what we need to learn more of in San Diego and around the world. There's a lot of unfairness everywhere. People are being hurt everywhere because people don't know how to be fair.
We're going to leave it right
Be
here.
just.
And thanks for joining us, gentlemen, and sharing your thoughts. It has been an honor. The Reverend George Walker Smith and Leon Williams. And for NBC's recognition of Black History Month, I'm Gene Cubbison. Have a great week ahead.